Chapter, Laying Plans. The wind howled through the shadow heights as Harguth and Zul'jin sat huddled around a crackling campfire. The orange and yellow flames danced wildly, casting a warm glow on their rugged Orcish features. They were deep in discussion, their voices low and serious as they strategized for the upcoming war. The camp was silent save for the occasional snap of a twig in the fire and the distant howl of a wolf. As they sat there, surrounded by the rugged beauty of the mountain range, they knew that the fate of their tribe, and possibly the entire land, lay in their hands. And so, they sat by the fire, their eyes fixed on the flickering flames, their minds focused on the battles to come. "We must prepare and plan carefully if we are to succeed," Harguth said, gesturing with his hands as he spoke. "The wisdom of our ancestors teaches us that the outcome of any battle lies in the hands of fate." Zul'jin grunted, stirring the fire with a stick as he did so. "Indeed, we must take heed of the terrain and use it to our advantage. We must be ever vigilant in our strategy and watch for any signs of weakness from our enemies." He paused and added, "We must also remember that fortune favors the bold and those who are prepared." "The art of war is of vital importance to the tribe," Harguth began. "We must be aware of our enemy's strengths and weaknesses, as well as of our own. We must use the terrain to our advantage and be ever vigilant." Zul'jin nodded. "Yes, it is a wise strategy to use the land to our benefit. We must also remember that no battle plan is foolproof, and fate will ultimately decide our fate." He gestured towards the fire with his hand, adding, "But we can still prepare for the worst and hope for the best." "It is true," Zul'jin said, gesturing with his hands as he spoke. "This is a matter of life and death, a road either to safety or ruin. We must take utmost care in our strategy if we are to succeed. We must heed the wisdom of our ancestors and be ever vigilant in our battle plans." Harguth continued. "Yes, indeed. We must pay close attention to our surroundings and use the terrain to our advantage if we are to win this war. At the same time, we must not forget that the outcome of any battle lies in the hands of fate." He looked into the fire, its crackling and popping providing a backdrop to their conversation. "It is said," Zul'jin began, gesturing to the fire with his hands, "that 5 constants must be considered when planning for war. We must understand our enemy, our terrain, the weather, our own strengths and weaknesses, and the influence of fate." Harguth agreed. "Yes. We must pay close attention to all of these factors if we are to succeed. Our ancestors have taught us that we must use our wits and take advantage of every opportunity if we wish to survive." He paused for a moment before adding, "And we must also remember that no matter how well we plan, fate will always have a hand in the outcome of any battle." Zul'jin nodded grimly, his eyes flickering with the glow of the fire. "It is true," he stated solemnly, "that we must take utmost care in our strategy if we are to succeed. We must heed the wisdom of our ancestors and be ever vigilant in our battle plans. The moral law, heaven, earth, the commander, method and discipline must all be taken into account if we are to have any hope of victory." Harguth grunted in agreement. He looked up at the night sky and said, "The outcome of any battle lies in the hands of fate. We must remember that no matter how much we plan, ultimately it is out of our control." Harguth nodded as he stoked the fire. "It is true that we must be united in our cause and remain resolute if we are to succeed. The wisdom of our ancestors tells us that the outcome of any battle lies in the hands of fate, and so we must use all of our strength and cunning to ensure victory." Zul'jin's eyes twinkled in the light of the fire. "We must also have faith in ourselves and be willing to take risks in order to achieve our goals. We must remember that no plan is perfect and make adjustments on the fly if needed. Tempest signifies night and day, cold and heat, times and seasons. Therefore, we must take into account the changes in weather and climate to ensure our success." Harguth nodded slowly. "Yes, even the slightest shift in the wind can make or break a battle." He gestured towards the fire with one hand. "We must always be mindful of the environment and how it affects our plans." The sound of crickets chirping and the crackling of the fire filled the night air as Harguth continued. "Our ancestors often said that war is not won by strength alone. We must use our wits and cunning to outsmart our enemies and come out victorious." He grunted in approval and added, "It is wisdom that will guide us to victory." "It is true," Zul'jin nodded, gesturing to the fire with his hand. We must take great care in assessing our strategy and use our wisdom of the ancients to ensure success. We should be aware of our surroundings and use the land to our advantage if we are to win this war. He paused and grunted softly, we must embody the 5 virtues of our ancestors if we are to succeed. We must be wise and sincere in our plans, benevolent to those who aid us, and courageous and strict with our enemies. He paused for a moment, then added, only then will we prevail. Harguth agreed and added, our success lies in our ability to use all of these virtues in concert. We must never forget that fate plays its part too. He made a few quick gestures with his hands as he spoke, emphasizing his words. It is known, Zul'jin said as he stoked the fire, that we must be organized and disciplined in our approach if we are to succeed. Our ancestors have taught us that a well-structured army and an efficient supply chain are essential for victory. Harguth grunted and nodded his head. We must also remember that it is not just the strategy of the battle that determines the outcome, but also the will of the gods. He paused for a moment before adding, the fate of this war rests in their hands. It is said that the 5 heads of warfare must be known and understood in order to achieve victory, Zul'jin said, gesturing with his hands as he spoke. The first is the knowledge of yourself and your enemy. The second is the terrain and its advantages. The third is the timing of your attack. The fourth is the use of strategy and tactics. And the fifth is the composition of your forces. Harguth nodded in agreement. Indeed. We must understand our strengths and weaknesses, as well as those of our enemies. We must also consider the terrain and how it can be used to our advantage. Then we must choose the right time to attack and use the most effective strategies and tactics. Finally, we must make sure our forces are composed correctly for maximum effectiveness. Harguth nodded and said, it is wise to consider these factors when making battle plans. Who has the greater moral law? Who is more capable? Who has the advantage of heaven and earth? Which army is better disciplined? Who has the stronger force? Who is better trained? And which army rewards and punishes more fairly? Zul'jin grunted and added, we must also remember that no matter how well we plan, the outcome of any battle lies in the hands of fate. He poked at the fire with a stick, sending up sparks into the night sky. It is said, Harguth began, gesturing with his hands as he spoke, that 7 considerations will determine whether we will achieve victory or suffer defeat. He paused and used a branch to stoke the flames of the fire before continuing. We must consider the terrain, the weather, our enemy's strength, our own strength, supplies, tactics, and morale. He glanced up at Zul'jin, who nodded. Yes, Zul'jin replied. We must use all of these considerations to our advantage if we are to succeed in this war. Let us not forget the importance of the element of surprise either, for it can mean the difference between victory and defeat. Harguth nodded and said, it is wise counsel indeed. We must heed the words of our ancestors in order to succeed in battle. We must be vigilant in our strategy and use the terrain to our advantage. The outcome of any battle lies in the hands of fate and we must trust in our strength and courage. Zul'jin shifted the logs in the fire, sparks flying up into the night sky. Aye, 'tis true. We must be ever watchful and plan with precision if we are to win this war. Zul'jin gestured to the fire. Indeed, we must take advantage of our environment and all the elements that are available to us. We must use all our resources to gain an edge over our enemies. Harguth grunted and added, we must also remember that no amount of strategy or planning can guarantee victory. There is always a chance that even with the best battle plans, fate will be against us. The 2 orcs sat in silence for a moment, staring into the flames of the fire as they crackled and popped. The sounds of the night forest were soothing and comforting. In the distance, a wolf howled. It is true, Zul'jin said, gesturing with his hands as he spoke, that we must remain flexible in our strategies. We must be able to adapt to ever-changing circumstances and adjust our plans accordingly if we are to succeed. Harguth continued, we must also remember that fortune favors the brave and those who are willing to take risks. We must be bold in our actions and never shy away from difficult tasks. The 2 orcs exchanged a knowing look, and then Harguth tossed another log onto the fire. The sound of crackling wood filled the air as they sat in companionable silence and contemplated their next move. Zul'jin sighed and said, indeed. We must use strategy to outwit our enemies. We must be cunning and cunningly create illusions to deceive them and make them think our forces are more powerful than they really are. We must also remember to use the terrain to our advantage. Our ancestors taught us that using the environment can be a powerful tool in battle. Harguth gestured to the fire with his hands as he spoke, and small sparks flew up into the night sky. It is said, Harguth began, gesturing with his hands for emphasis, that we must seem inactive when we are using our forces, and appear far away when we are near. We must also deceive our enemy into believing that what we cannot do, we can. Indeed, Zul'jin agreed, nodding in understanding. We must be ever vigilant in our strategies and outwit the enemy at every turn. For if we are able to anticipate their plans, we will have the upper hand. He paused for a moment, then added, "Fate favors the wise and prepared." We must use deception and misdirection to draw out our enemies, Harguth said, gesturing with his hands. If we can lure them into a false sense of security, then we can catch them off guard and strike when they least expect it. Zul'jin nodded. Yes, we must be cunning. If we can make them believe that we are disorganized and weak, then they will not suspect our true strength until it is too late. He pounded his fist on the ground for emphasis. We must also remember that even the mightiest of foes can be defeated if we have the courage and wisdom to face them. Harguth nodded and said, "The wisdom of our ancestors teaches us that if we are facing an enemy who has the advantage in strength, we must evade him. But if he is secure at all points, then we must be prepared for him." Zul'jin stoked the fire with a stick. He said, "It is also important to remember that we must never underestimate our opponents. We must use cunning and strategy to gain the upper hand in battle. It is said," Harguth began, gesturing with his hands, "that if we face an enemy of a hot-blooded nature, we should seek to enrage him. We can use our seeming weakness to make him arrogant and careless." Zul'jin was deep in thought, the firelight casting shadows across his face. Yes, and we must also be aware that our own emotions can be just as dangerous as those of our enemies. We must remain calm and composed no matter what the situation. He paused for a moment, his gaze still on the flames. We must remember that even the greatest of plans can fail without the proper execution. Zul'jin nodded, his eyes narrowed in thought. Our enemy is strong and unified. We must use our cunning to sow discord among them. We must also strive to keep our own forces united and motivated. If we can divide their focus, we may be able to gain an advantage. Harguth stirred the fire with a stick. Sparks flew up into the night sky as he spoke. We must also take care not to underestimate our opponents. Their strength and determination should never be underestimated. He paused for a moment before continuing. We must also remember that even the mightiest of warriors can fall if they are too careless or lack caution. Harguth nodded sagely and said, "We must use our cunning and strike when our enemy is least expecting it. We must also be sure to appear in places where we are not anticipated." Zul'jin continued, "It is true that the element of surprise can be our greatest ally. We must also be prepared for any eventuality and remain flexible in our strategies." He gestured towards the fire as he spoke, his eyes aglow with the flames. "We must keep our plans secret, for it is only through the element of surprise that we will have a chance at victory," Harguth said as he stirred the fire with a stick. Zul'jin grunted in agreement and added, "Yes, if we reveal our strategy too soon, we risk giving our enemy an advantage. It is said," Harguth began, gesturing with his hands as he spoke, "that a wise leader must consider all possible outcomes before engaging in battle. We must think carefully and plan ahead if we are to succeed." Zul'jin added, "The fortune of war is always uncertain, but we can increase our chances of victory by wisely preparing for battle and employing the strategies of our ancestors." Harguth nodded and stirred the fire. "Yes, indeed. Our success depends on our preparation and knowledge of our opponents. We must be ready for anything." Harguth nodded and said, "Our ancestors taught us to always prepare for battle. To be aware of our surroundings and use the terrain to our advantage is essential if we want to emerge victorious. We must make sure that our plans are well thought out, and take into account every possibility." Zul'jin grunted and added, "We must also remember to trust our instincts and heed the will of fate. No plan is foolproof, and it is important to remain flexible and adaptable." He paused for a moment, then concluded, "Let us hope that our careful preparations and attention to detail will lead us to victory."